Some promises are too sacred to sink, even when the sea tries to bury them. Dawn has not yet broken over the coast of Maine, and the Atlantic lies beneath a blanket of pale gray fog that swallows every landmark except the mournful cry of distant gulls and the slow rhythm of waves rolling against invisible rocks. The air smells of salt, cold iron, and diesel drifting from ships hidden somewhere beyond the mist. A stiff November wind cuts across the water, carrying a chill that settles deep into bone, the kind every sailor along this coast learns to respect. Aboard the USS Carver, a Navy coastal patrol vessel returning from an overnight surveillance mission, the crew moves with quiet discipline through the fading darkness. Commander Nathan Briggs stands on the bridge with one gloved hand resting against the chart table, his hazel eyes fixed on the endless white curtain ahead. At 44, the lines around his eyes have been carved by years at sea rather than age alone, and he has learned that the Atlantic often whispers before it reveals its secrets. The radar display flickers with ordinary traffic until a tiny signal appears near the edge of the screen, weak enough to disappear with every passing swell. Possible distress beacon, the young radar operator says, uncertainty lingering in his voice. Briggs studies the screen without speaking. Fishing buoys fail every week along this coast. So do forgotten transmitters drifting from abandoned vessels. Yet something about this signal refuses to vanish completely. Alter course 2 degrees east, he says calmly. Let's have a look. Down on the observation deck, Chief Petty Officer Owen Mercer raises a pair of binoculars toward the empty horizon. At first, he sees nothing except shifting layers of fog. Then a shape slowly emerges where sea and sky seem to meet. It is not a fishing boat, not a life raft, just a small emergency skiff rocking helplessly between the swells. Visual contact, Owen calls through the radio. One survival craft. As the Carver draws closer, more details emerge through the mist. There is someone inside. A woman lies motionless beneath a soaked emergency blanket, one arm hanging over the side as icy seawater splashes against her fingertips. Kneeling above her is a German shepherd unlike any Owen has ever seen. The large sable-coated dog stands perfectly still despite the unstable boat, every muscle balanced, every amber eye fixed on the approaching Navy vessel. One ear bears a small tear, his thick fur darkened by seawater, yet there is nothing frantic about him. He does not bark. He does not beg. He simply watches. The skiff rises and falls with each swell, while the shepherd shifts only enough to keep his body between the unconscious woman and the rest of the world. Owen lowers his binoculars for a moment, feeling something he cannot quite explain settle in his chest. "Commander," he says quietly over the headset, "that dog isn't guarding himself." Briggs steps onto the bridge wing, lifting his own binoculars. The image sharpens. The woman appears barely alive, her face pale against the soaked blanket. The shepherd lowers his head briefly, touching his nose against her shoulder before looking back toward the approaching ship. It is not fear in those eyes. It is expectation, as if he has been waiting for exactly this vessel to appear from the fog. "Launch the rescue team," Briggs orders immediately. Engines shift. Sailors move. Orange rescue gear flashes across the deck. Yet just as the inflatable boat is lowered into the water, the shepherd suddenly plants all four paws firmly over something hidden beneath the woman's jacket. His posture changes. Calm becomes absolute resolve. Whatever rests beneath him matters more than the freezing sea, more than the approaching Navy crew, perhaps even more than his own exhausted body. And for the first time that morning, every sailor aboard the USS Carver realizes they are not simply rescuing survivors. They are about to uncover something one faithful dog has refused to leave behind. The rescue boat cut through the swells with steady determination, its outboard engine humming beneath the cries of circling gulls that had begun to gather above the lonely skiff. Owen Mercer sat near the bow with one hand gripping the safety line, while two Navy rescue swimmers prepared blankets, medical supplies, and a thermal stretcher. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. Even the youngest sailor sensed there was something unusual waiting inside the drifting boat. The fog had thinned just enough for the first pale streaks of sunrise to color the eastern horizon, but the water remained steel gray, cold enough to steal strength from even the strongest swimmer within minutes. As the inflatable closed the final 20 feet, Atlas never took his eyes off the approaching men. His broad chest rose and fell slowly, every breath visible in the freezing air. He did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. Instead, he stood exactly where he had been, one front paw resting firmly over the hidden bundle beneath Claire's soaked jacket, while his body shielded her from the wind, as if he alone could keep the cold away. Owen raised one empty hand before the boat reached the skiff. "Easy, buddy," he said softly, his voice almost disappearing into the wind. "We are here to help her." Atlas watched him without moving. Those amber eyes carried neither panic nor aggression. They carried judgment, as though the dog had spent endless hours deciding which humans could still be trusted. The inflatable bumped gently against the side of the skiff. One rescuer reached toward Claire, but Atlas immediately shifted his weight, placing himself between the stranger and the unconscious woman. The movement was controlled, almost polite, yet unmistakably firm. The sailor froze. Owen slowly removed one glove and tucked it into his pocket before reaching out with his bare hand instead. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the weathered fiberglass rather than toward the dog. "You have done your job," he whispered. "Now let us do ours." For several long seconds, nothing happened except the steady splash of waves against both boats. Then Atlas lowered his head and gently nudged Claire's shoulder again. The woman did not respond. Her breathing was so faint Owen had to lean closer to see the slight rise beneath the soaked blanket. The shepherd looked back at Owen once more, searching his face with quiet intensity. Finally, Atlas stepped backward exactly one pace. It was not surrender. It was permission. The rescue swimmers moved immediately, lifting Claire with careful hands onto the thermal stretcher while wrapping her in insulated blankets to protect what little body heat remained. Atlas stayed so close that his damp shoulder brushed against her arm the entire time, refusing to let even an inch of distance separate them. As Owen reached beneath the blanket to retrieve the object hidden under Atlas's paw, the dog instantly blocked his hand again, this time placing his nose against the bundle before looking directly into Owen's eyes. Owen stopped. Whatever lay beneath the fabric could wait. Claire could not. "Take them together," he ordered quietly. "Nothing gets separated." The stretcher was transferred carefully into the inflatable, and Atlas climbed aboard without hesitation, positioning himself beside Claire once again. Only after every person was safely seated did Owen glance back toward the abandoned skiff. It rocked alone on the cold Atlantic, slowly disappearing into the morning fog that had nearly claimed 2 lives. As the rescue boat accelerated toward the USS Carver, Lieutenant Dr. Sarah Keene was already waiting on deck with a medical team. The sailors prepared to save a stranger they had never met. None of them noticed that Atlas had not looked at the Navy ship a single time during the return trip. His unwavering gaze remained fixed on the soaked bundle beneath Claire's arm, guarding it with the same silent devotion that had carried him through the longest night of his life. The moment Claire was lifted onto the deck of the USS Carver, the quiet efficiency of a Navy medical team replaced the restless rhythm of the sea. Warm lights reflected against damp steel as Lieutenant Dr. Sarah Keene knelt beside the stretcher, carefully checking Claire's breathing while another corpsman covered her with heated blankets fresh from the medical bay. The sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with seawater and diesel fuel lingered in the cold morning air. Atlas stepped onto the deck without hesitation, his soaked paws leaving dark prints across the metal surface, but he never wandered farther than a few feet from Claire. Every sailor who passed glanced at the German shepherd, expecting nervous pacing or frantic barking. Instead, they found a patient guardian whose steady eyes followed every movement around the unconscious woman. Commander Nathan Briggs watched from the edge of the flight deck before quietly joining Owen Mercer beside the medical team. "How is she?" he asked. Dr. Keene kept listening to Claire's breathing before answering. "She is dangerously cold, but she is fighting. We need to get her inside immediately." As the stretcher rolled toward the medical compartment, Atlas moved alongside without waiting for permission. One young sailor instinctively stepped into the hallway to block him, but Owen gently rested a hand on the sailor's shoulder. "Let him stay," he said. "He has earned that much." Inside the medical room, warm air replaced the biting wind outside. Machines hummed softly while heated intravenous fluids began restoring Claire's body temperature. Atlas settled beside the examination table without making a sound, his tired head resting near Claire's hand as though he feared she might disappear if he looked away. Dr. Keene noticed several old rope marks around Claire's wrists, but said nothing. This was not the time for questions. Survival came first. Meanwhile, Commander Briggs entered the operations center and instructed his communications officer to identify the rescued woman through every available database. Fingerprints could wait until she recovered, but facial recognition, missing persons reports, Coast Guard notifications, and state emergency records could all begin immediately. Minutes passed, then 30. Finally, the communications specialist looked up from his monitor with a puzzled expression. "Sir, I cannot find her." Briggs frowned. "Run it again." The search returned the same answer. No active missing person report. No recent rescue notification. No maritime passenger record. No emergency beacon registered to her name. It was as if the woman lying only 50 feet away had simply appeared out of the Atlantic without leaving a trace anywhere on land. Owen folded his arms as he stared at the screen. "That is impossible." "I agree," Briggs replied quietly. "But impossible is exactly what we have." Back inside the medical compartment, Atlas suddenly lifted his head before anyone else noticed the faint movement beneath Claire's blanket. Her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. Dr. Keene stepped closer as Claire slowly opened her eyes for only a second before the bright lights forced them closed again. Her lips trembled, struggling to form words after hours of silence. Atlas gently nudged her hand with his nose, and her fingers instinctively curled into the damp fur around his neck. She did not ask where she was. She did not ask whether she had survived. Barely above a whisper, she spoke only one sentence. "Do not let anyone take it." Her eyes closed again almost immediately. Owen looked toward the bundle still tucked securely beneath her arm, wrapped inside the soaked emergency blanket exactly where Atlas had guarded it through the endless night. He reached for it carefully, but before his fingers touched the fabric, Atlas quietly stood, placing himself between Owen and the mysterious package once again. There was no growl, no threat, only an unshakable certainty that whatever rested inside had not yet reached the hands it was meant for. Owen slowly withdrew his hand and exchanged a long glance with Commander Briggs. Neither man spoke, but both realized the same unsettling truth. The woman they had rescued was carrying a secret, and somehow that faithful German shepherd understood its importance better than anyone else aboard the ship. The medical compartment remained quiet except for the gentle rhythm of monitors and the distant vibration of the ship pushing steadily through the morning sea. Outside, the fog was beginning to surrender to a pale winter sun, but inside the room, time seemed suspended. Atlas had not changed positions in nearly an hour. He sat beside Claire's bed with remarkable patience, his tired eyes never drifting far from her face. Occasionally his ears twitched toward footsteps in the hallway, yet each time he relaxed again after recognizing the familiar voices of the Navy crew. Dr. Sarah Keene adjusted another warm blanket over Claire before stepping back to review the latest readings. Her color had slowly returned, and the dangerous chill was finally leaving her body. "She is stronger now," she said quietly to Owen Mercer. "When she wakes again, she should be able to answer a few questions, but do not rush her." Owen nodded, understanding that some stories surfaced only when people believed they were finally safe. Late that morning, Claire opened her eyes once more. This time they remained open. She stared silently at the white ceiling before turning toward the familiar weight resting against her arm. Atlas immediately lifted his head. His tail tapped the deck only once before he gently pressed his muzzle into her open hand. Claire closed her fingers around the damp fur behind his ear, and for the first time since the rescue, a faint expression of relief crossed her exhausted face. "You stayed," she whispered. Atlas answered by closing his eyes for a brief moment, as though the words themselves had released a burden he had carried through the endless night. Owen stepped into the room carefully, stopping several feet away to avoid startling either of them. "My name is Owen Mercer," he said softly. "You are aboard the USS Carver. You are safe now." Claire listened without speaking. She slowly looked around the room before returning her gaze to Atlas. "How long?" she finally asked. "About 6 hours since we found you," Owen replied. She nodded almost absent-mindedly, as though measuring something only she could understand. Then she spoke another question that surprised everyone present. "Was the skiff recovered?" Owen exchanged a glance with Dr. Keene before answering honestly. "No. The current carried it away before we could secure it." Claire closed her eyes briefly, neither relieved nor disappointed. "That is all right," she murmured. "It already served its purpose." Silence settled over the room once again until Owen carefully asked the question that had occupied every conversation aboard the ship. "Can you tell us your name?" Claire hesitated for several seconds before answering. "Claire Whitmore." Owen repeated the name quietly, trying to place it somewhere in memory, but nothing came. "Do you know who left you out there?" Claire's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around Atlas's fur. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the small waterproof bundle still resting against her side beneath the blanket. "Someone who believed the ocean could erase people," she said at last. They were wrong. Those 5 words hung in the room with unexpected weight. Owen noticed Atlas glance toward the bundle again before returning his attention to Claire. It was almost as though the dog already understood every sentence before it was spoken. Commander Nathan Briggs entered moments later carrying a thin folder that contained the disappointing results of every database search. He introduced himself politely before saying, "Miss Whitmore, we have searched every available record. We cannot find any recent report connected to you. There is no passenger manifest, no emergency alert, no missing person notification. It is almost as if you vanished before anyone realized you were gone." Claire stared quietly through the small round porthole where sunlight shimmered across the Atlantic. "That was the plan," she answered. The room fell silent once more. No one asked another question. Then, as Atlas shifted slightly beside the bed, the edge of the waterproof bundle slipped free from beneath the blanket just enough for Owen to notice a weathered brass corner and the faint outline of an engraved pair of initials hidden beneath dried salt. Even before he could read them clearly, he realized this ordinary-looking package had been protected with extraordinary devotion, and whatever story Claire carried had begun long before that lonely night upon the sea. The afternoon sun climbed higher above the Atlantic, scattering pale silver light across the rolling water outside the portholes. But inside the USS Carver the mystery only deepened. Claire rested quietly, while Dr. Sarah Keene insisted she regain more strength before answering further questions. A steaming cup of broth sat untouched beside her bed. Atlas remained at her side, his breathing finally slower now that warmth had replaced the freezing wind, yet every few moments his eyes drifted toward the waterproof bundle resting against Claire's arm. It was not the anxious glance of an animal protecting food or comfort. It was the calm vigilance of someone honoring a promise. Owen Mercer noticed it immediately. Years spent working with military working dogs had taught him that loyalty always had a reason. Dogs rarely guarded objects. They guarded meaning. He pulled a chair beside Claire's bed and spoke with the same patience that had earned Atlas's trust on the rescue boat. "You told us someone believed the ocean could erase people," he said gently. "Help us understand." Claire stared at the folded blanket across her lap before answering. 4 years ago, my younger brother disappeared off this same coast. She paused as though each memory carried its own weight. His name was Thomas Whitmore. Owen remained silent, allowing the story to unfold at its own pace. Claire reached down and slowly rested her hand on Atlas's neck. Atlas belonged to Thomas first. They worked together during civilian search and rescue operations along the Maine coastline. Wherever Thomas went, Atlas went. They trusted each other more than words ever could. Atlas closed his eyes briefly at the sound of the familiar name, then leaned gently into Claire's hand. Even Commander Nathan Briggs, standing quietly near the doorway, noticed the subtle change in the shepherd's expression. "Thomas uncovered something he was never supposed to find," Claire continued. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I should never stop asking questions." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected years of unanswered grief. A week later, they said his boat was lost during bad weather. They called it an accident. They never found his body. The room remained silent except for the distant hum of the ship's engines. "And Atlas?" Owen asked softly. Claire looked down at the German shepherd with a faint smile touched by sadness. "Atlas came home alone." No one spoke for several moments. The simple sentence carried more heartbreak than 100 explanations ever could. After Thomas disappeared, Claire continued, Atlas refused to leave the harbor for weeks. Every morning, he waited at the same dock before sunrise. Every evening, he walked home alone. Dr. Keene lowered her eyes, quietly pretending to review medical notes, so Claire could continue without feeling watched. Eventually, I took him home with me, Claire said. I thought I was rescuing him. She slowly shook her head. I understand now that he was rescuing me. Atlas lifted his head and gently rested it across Claire's knee. She smiled for the first time since coming aboard the ship, a small, genuine smile that softened the exhaustion in her face. Owen's attention drifted once more toward the weathered waterproof bundle. Does it belong to Thomas? He asked. Claire answered without hesitation. Yes. Every eye in the room settled on the package. Owen carefully chose his next words. Is that what Atlas has been protecting? Claire looked at Atlas before looking back at Owen. That is what everyone believes. The answer surprised every person present. Before anyone could ask another question, Atlas quietly stood, walked 2 slow steps away from the bundle, and turned his attention instead toward his own worn leather collar. He lowered his nose until it touched the weathered brass buckle, then looked directly at Claire. She froze. A flicker of realization crossed her face, followed by disbelief. It was as though the faithful shepherd had just reminded her of something she had completely forgotten, something Thomas himself had trusted only Atlas to remember. Claire stared at Atlas for several long seconds, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and memory. The German shepherd remained perfectly still beside the examination table, his nose resting against the weathered leather collar that had circled his neck for years. Until that moment, she had never looked at it as anything more than an old piece of equipment worn smooth by salt air, rain, and countless miles along the Maine shoreline. Slowly, almost cautiously, she reached toward him. Atlas did not move away. He simply watched her with quiet patience, as though he had been waiting years for this exact moment. Her fingertips brushed the worn brass buckle before sliding beneath the thick leather strap. There, hidden inside the folded lining, she felt something that had never belonged in an ordinary dog collar. It was small, flat, and carefully secured beneath layers of stitched leather. Claire's breathing caught. Thomas, she whispered almost without realizing she had spoken aloud. Owen Mercer stepped closer but stopped several feet away, allowing her the space to continue. Commander Nathan Briggs folded his arms silently, while Dr. Sarah Keene remained near the doorway, sensing that the next few moments belonged not to medicine, but to memory. With gentle hands, Claire loosened a nearly invisible seam that age had begun to weaken. From inside the collar, she carefully removed a tiny waterproof capsule no larger than a house key. Every eye in the room fixed upon it. Atlas lowered himself to the deck and released a slow breath, his tail giving one quiet sweep across the floor before becoming still again. For the first time since the rescue, the weight he had carried seemed lighter. Claire turned the capsule over in her palm. Salt stains covered its surface, but one tiny engraving remained visible beneath the worn finish. 2 initials. T. W. Tears gathered in her eyes without falling. I remember now, she said softly. The night before Thomas disappeared, he kept replacing Atlas's collar. I joked that he was spoiling his dog. He just smiled and told me that sometimes the safest place to hide the truth is where everyone looks, but nobody ever sees. Owen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Atlantic. All this time, they had believed the weathered bundle beneath Claire's arm was the object Atlas had protected. The faithful shepherd had allowed them to think exactly that. In reality, his attention had never been fixed on the package itself. It had always returned to the collar he carried every day without complaint. Commander Briggs carefully accepted the tiny capsule after Claire nodded her permission. We will examine this without damaging it, he said quietly. If it contains what Thomas wanted preserved, we will protect it. Claire looked directly at him. Please do not open it yet. Briggs paused. Why? She drew a slow breath before answering. Because Thomas never trusted evidence without context. The package explains why the capsule exists. Owen turned toward the waterproof bundle resting on the bed. For the first time since boarding the ship, Atlas made no effort to block anyone from approaching it. Instead, he remained lying peacefully beside Claire, watching her rather than the package. It was as if the shepherd understood that the first part of his mission had finally been completed. Outside the porthole, the Atlantic shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, calm enough to hide every storm that had come before. Deep within the ship, the navigation system chimed softly as an incoming coastal bulletin appeared on the operations console. It reported that a privately owned research vessel had unexpectedly altered course less than 12 miles from the USS Carver before disappearing behind a bank of fog. Commander Briggs read the brief report once, then looked back toward the tiny capsule resting carefully in his hand. Somewhere beyond that quiet horizon, someone might already know that Claire Whitmore had survived, but they could not possibly know that the one secret they had tried to bury had never drifted across the ocean at all. It had sailed safely aboard every step Atlas had taken. Commander Nathan Briggs carried the tiny waterproof capsule to the ship's secure operations room with the same care another man might have given a family heirloom. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a sky that had finally turned blue, but no one aboard the USS Carver mistook the calm water for safety. The afternoon breeze rattled loose halyards against steel masts while the steady pulse of the engines echoed through every passageway. Claire, wrapped in a navy blanket, slowly walked from the medical compartment for the first time since her rescue. Dr. Sarah Keene remained close enough to help if needed, but Claire insisted on standing on her own. Atlas walked beside her without a leash, matching every careful step, occasionally glancing back as though making certain she had truly regained the strength to follow. Inside the operations room, Commander Briggs placed both the weathered waterproof bundle and the tiny capsule on the conference table. Owen Mercer stood nearby, studying the objects that had survived salt water, time, and betrayal. "You said the package explains the capsule," Briggs said quietly. Claire nodded and reached for the bundle herself. Atlas washed her hands, but he remained completely relaxed. The quiet vigilance that had defined every moment since the rescue had softened into something closer to trust. Claire loosened the faded straps surrounding the waterproof case. Inside rested a worn leather journal sealed inside another protective sleeve, a folded navigation chart covered with handwritten notes, and a simple envelope bearing one sentence in Thomas Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting. It read, "Open this only after Atlas brings you home." Claire closed her eyes for a moment before carefully unfolding the letter. The paper smelled faintly of old cedar and sea salt, preserved by the waterproof seal through 4 long years. She began reading aloud, her voice barely louder than the hum of the ship. "Claire, if you are holding this letter, then Atlas has done exactly what I prayed he would do. I know you will blame yourself if I do not come back, so I need you to hear this before you believe anyone else's version of my story. None of this is your fault." The room became completely still. Even the faint clicking of electronic equipment seemed to disappear. Claire continued reading through quiet tears. "There are people using the ocean to hide more than cargo. I gathered enough proof to expose them, but proof without the truth behind it becomes just another forgotten file. That is why I divided everything. The journal tells the story. The collar carries the evidence. One without the other is meaningless." Owen slowly looked toward Atlas, who rested peacefully at Claire's feet. He knew. Owen whispered almost to himself. Claire smiled gently through her tears. Thomas trusted him with the only copy he believed would survive. Commander Briggs carefully opened the leather journal. Instead of accusations or anger, its pages contained dates, coordinates, weather conditions, vessel names, and calm observations recorded with remarkable precision. Everything read like the careful work of a man who expected every word to be examined one day. Tucked inside the final page rested a small handwritten note. Briggs lifted it carefully and read it aloud. "If you have reached this page before opening the capsule, thank you for believing Atlas before believing appearances." Owen could not help smiling at the sentence. The faithful shepherd raised his head at the sound of his name, but remained quietly beside Claire. Briggs then handed the waterproof capsule to the ship's communications specialist, who gently connected it to a secure reader without forcing or damaging its seal. A small indicator light blinked once before a list of encrypted files appeared across the monitor. Before anyone opened them, an alert sounded from the navigation console. The communications officer turned toward the bridge display. "Commander, the private research vessel reported earlier has changed course again. It is now moving away from the coastline at unusually high speed, and it stopped transmitting its public identification signal 8 minutes ago." Briggs exchanged a thoughtful glance with Owen. "Perhaps coincidence," Owen said. Briggs looked back at the glowing monitor, then toward Claire and Atlas standing quietly together. "Perhaps," he answered. Or perhaps someone has just realized that the truth they abandoned never disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Atlas slowly lifted his ears toward the distant vibration of engines somewhere beyond the horizon. He did not bark. He simply stared toward the unseen water with the same unwavering focus he had shown from the drifting skiff. And for reasons none of them could fully explain, every person in the room suddenly felt that the story Thomas Whitmore had entrusted to one faithful shepherd was only beginning to surface. The encrypted files opened one by one beneath the soft glow of the operations room monitors. Nobody spoke as lines of coordinates, shipping logs, maintenance reports, and carefully organized records filled the screens. Thomas Whitmore had documented everything with extraordinary patience. There were no dramatic accusations, no emotional pleas, only facts assembled with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the truth could defend itself if it survived long enough to be heard. Commander Nathan Briggs leaned closer as the communications specialist cross-referenced several vessel numbers with publicly available maritime records. One after another, the names matched legitimate commercial ships that had quietly changed ownership over the past 5 years. Several had disappeared from service shortly after Thomas's final entries. Owen Mercer slowly exhaled. He knew exactly what he was doing. Claire stood beside the table with one hand resting lightly against Atlas's shoulder. She had spent 4 years believing she was chasing the memory of her brother. Now she understood she had been carrying the beginning of his work instead of its ending. Atlas remained perfectly calm. The anxious vigilance that had marked every mile of the journey across the Atlantic had finally given way to peaceful stillness, as though he recognized that the burden Thomas had placed upon him was reaching the people it had always been intended for. Dr. Sarah Keene quietly stepped toward Claire with a cup of warm tea. Claire accepted it with grateful hands, though her eyes never left the monitor displaying Thomas's final journal entry. At the bottom of the page, beneath pages of coordinates and observations, appeared one final sentence entered only hours before his disappearance. If this reaches the right people, then no sacrifice is ever truly lost. The words settled gently across the room. Nobody answered them because nobody needed to. Commander Briggs closed the journal with careful hands. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "your brother trusted honesty more than fear. We will make certain his work reaches the proper authorities through official channels." Claire looked toward the small porthole where afternoon sunlight shimmered across the endless water. For the first time in years, the horizon no longer felt like a place that had taken everything from her. It had become the place that had quietly returned the one thing she thought was gone forever: her faith in the truth. She knelt beside Atlas and wrapped both arms around his strong neck. The German shepherd leaned gently against her without making a sound. His eyes remained fixed on hers, calm and unwavering, as though he had been waiting not for justice, but for this single moment when she would finally stop carrying guilt that had never belonged to her. A tear slipped down Claire's cheek before disappearing into the thick fur along Atlas's shoulder. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Atlas answered only by resting his head against her chest. Owen looked away toward the windows, giving them the privacy that sometimes means more than words. Even the crew members quietly passing through the corridor seemed to lower their voices without understanding why. Outside, the Atlantic rolled beneath the late afternoon sun with the same timeless rhythm it had carried long before any of them were born. The sea had witnessed loss, silence, courage, and hope, yet on this day it had surrendered something precious instead of taking it away. Commander Briggs carefully placed Thomas's journal, the waterproof capsule, and the recovered records into a secure evidence case before closing the lid with deliberate care. He looked once toward Atlas before speaking almost to himself. Sometimes the strongest witness never says a single word. No one disagreed. They simply watched the faithful shepherd remain beside Claire, no longer guarding a secret, but quietly protecting the person his first partner had trusted him to bring safely home. 3 months later, the harbor at Rockland welcomed another quiet sunrise. The wooden docks glistened with dew while lobster boats eased away from their slips, their engines rumbling gently across calm water. The air carried the familiar scent of salt, cedar, and fresh coffee drifting from the small cafes opening along the waterfront. Life had settled back into its ordinary rhythm, yet for Claire Whitmore, nothing about the morning felt ordinary anymore. She stood near the end of the pier wearing a heavy navy jacket against the cool coastal breeze. Beside her sat Atlas, his sable coat shining beneath the early light, the small tear on his left ear still visible, but now resting beneath a brand-new leather collar. Attached beside his identification tag hung the weathered brass buckle Thomas had trusted years before. It no longer carried a secret. It carried a memory. Commander Nathan Briggs and Owen Mercer walked toward them from the parking area after attending a small private ceremony held for Thomas Whitmore. Following the official review of the recovered records, Thomas's work had finally been recognized for what it truly was, an honest effort to protect lives by preserving the truth. His journal and evidence had reached the proper authorities, and the questions surrounding his disappearance were no longer hidden beneath silence. Claire had spent years believing she had failed her brother. Standing beside the ocean that morning, she finally understood something Thomas had tried to tell her in his final letter. Love had never asked her to carry guilt. It had only asked her to keep living. Owen stopped beside Atlas and smiled. He looks different. Claire gently scratched behind the German shepherd's ear. He finally knows the watch is over. Atlas lifted his eyes toward Owen before calmly looking back across the water. A fishing boat passed the harbor entrance, its wake spreading across the bay in widening circles that shimmered beneath the rising sun. Commander Briggs reached into his coat pocket and handed Claire a small wooden box. Inside rested Thomas's compass, polished until the brass reflected the morning light. Beneath it lay a simple handwritten note from the Navy crew. It read, "Some people leave maps. Others become them." Claire closed the box slowly, holding it against her heart without saying a word. She no longer needed many words. The sea had taken enough of them. A volunteer rescue vessel prepared to depart from the neighboring dock, answering a report of a disabled sailboat several miles offshore. As crew members untied the lines, one of them waved toward Claire. "We could use another experienced set of hands if you are available." Claire looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd was already standing, ears forward, watching the rescue boat with the quiet focus that had always guided him whenever someone needed help. She smiled, not with sadness this time, but with peace. "What do you think, partner?" Atlas answered the only way he ever had. He stepped toward the waiting boat, then paused to make sure Claire was following beside him. Owen laughed softly while Commander Briggs watched the pair walk down the dock together. "Some stories never really end," Briggs said. "They simply become someone else's beginning." Claire stepped aboard the rescue vessel, and Atlas climbed up after her with the same steady confidence that had once carried hope across a cold Atlantic night. As the boat eased away from the pier, sunlight stretched across the water like a golden path leading toward the open sea. Claire rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder while the shoreline slowly drifted behind them. The ocean still held countless mysteries, countless storms, and countless souls waiting to be found. But neither of them feared the horizon anymore, because sometimes the greatest miracle is not surviving the darkness. It is discovering that faithful love has been quietly leading you home all along.